Okay, so welcome to all the participants as well as the speakers for our two-day conference on reforming economics education in India, Pluralistic Perspectives, jointly hosted by Rethinking Economics India Network and the Department of Economics, Satyavati College, University of Delhi. Now, all of us, most of us are associated with the teaching and learning, and as both some of us were students too at one time. So one can say that the teaching of economics as well as learning and research has become particularly challenging not only in the world but also in India, especially in the past few years. Special challenges have arisen because of various developments connected to political economy. So an initiative was put forward by the Department of Economics, Satyavati College, as well as Rethinking Economics India Network to jointly host this conference. And a number of issues were flagged, which all of you, I'm sure, are aware of. So to start off with a session, we have Professor Prabhat Patnaik now to deliver the keynote address. Now, Professor Prabhat Patnaik needs no introduction, but for the sake of formality, I'll just put in a few words. Professor Prabhat Patnaik is currently Professor Emeritus at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He has, during his many decades of teaching and research, sustained an alternative critical tradition that keeps a scientific approach to economics and political economy alive in a country like India. And I should say that I have been a student, so I've also profited from this experience. Now, he has a large body of published work, out of which I'll only mention a few here. His work has spanned a number of areas in both macroeconomics and political economy and other areas. So I'll briefly mention his key works. His key published works include, in chronological order, Time, Inflation and Growth, Economics and Egalitarianism, Accumulation and Stability under Capitalism, The Value of Money, A Theory of Imperialism, and Capital and Imperialism. Apart from this, he has also jointly authored a book on Demonetization Decoded. Besides, there have also been many book collections, out of which I'll mention where his articles have been collected and republished, out of which I'll mention three. The first one was Whatever Happened to Imperialism and Other Essays. The second was on The Retreat to Unfreedom. The third was basically on re-envisioning socialism. Now, I think I have spoken enough, and I now hand it over to Professor Prabhat Patnaik to start his keynote address.
Thank you very much, Sharad. First of all, I'm very grateful that I have been asked to give the keynote address in this very important seminar. Actually, the seminar is about a theme on which I have been feeling strongly for a very long time. And over time, if I may say so, my feelings have become even stronger compared to what they were at the beginning when I started off as a young lecturer. We know that economics, unlike the natural sciences, cannot be based on experimental data. I know there is a significant segment these days called experimental economics. There are many of my students and colleagues who do this. One of our students does this, got a Nobel Prize of Ajit Banerjee. But while experimental economics can actually deal with certain specific themes at best, it would not be able to answer the deep and broad questions in economics that really are on everybody's mind. The roots of mass poverty in India, for instance, is a question that everybody in India would be interested in. But that's not something about which you can do an experiment to find out. Because something which has happened through history, since you cannot repeat the history in an experiment, it is obvious that the experimental method cannot really help you very much in answering those kinds of questions. What happened? In fact, economics as a subject really deals with what happened in history, bringing it right up to the present. What happened to India's development right up to, let us say, the neoliberal period. So we are really talking about a subject which is historical in that sense. But remarkably, students of economics are not obliged to learn any economic history. I'm not even talking about general history. No economic history is taught to any student of economics in a compulsory manner. I know undergraduate students may be, but you can actually do a graduate work in economics, you can actually do a PhD and so on, without really knowing very much about what happened in history. As a matter of fact, uh, to know what happened in history, you would really have to have a particular passion for it, not something which you, as a matter of course, learn. Development of economic theory is never related to the development of economic history, whose product that theory is supposed ideally to have been. The theory should be a reflection upon history, but the development of economic theory or in learning economic theory, we never learn about the history whose reflection that theory is supposed to have been. Now, not only is it the case that economists, those learning economic theory, are not taught any history, or if they are taught some history in the undergraduate courses and so on, in that case, it's a separate pigeonhole. That basically you do theory and also you do some history. But theory is never related to history. That is kind of, not only is that a major problem with economics, but what is more, economics typically, economic theory, the mainstream economic theory typically invokes a history that never existed. That fundamentally, it invokes, if at all, implicitly, a false history. Now, it is this falsity about which I have been, developing a stronger and stronger view as I grow older. I'll give you three instances. The first instance, of course, is about growth theory. Now, if you look at contemporary growth theory, no matter you have all kinds of new growth theories and so on, but still, the most important, the most enduring theory of growth in mainstream economics is the one that was developed by Robert Solow. The theory of growth that says that ultimately the rate of growth of a capitalist economy is tethered to the rate of growth of its labor force in efficiency units. That means rate of growth of labor force in natural units plus the rate of growth of labor productivity arising from technological progress. Now, this particular theory, which has been, okay, you have had, as I mentioned, new growth theory, but fundamentally, you look at Piketty's book for it, is still going back to Solow's theory. Fundamentally, it is that theory that continues to remain the cornerstone of mainstream. The fact that historically, capitalist economies have moved millions of people across the globe. They have moved millions of people across the globe to provide them with the labor force in locations where they need this labor force. This is a fact of history. But at the same time, this fact is not recognized in the most important model of growth in a capitalist economy, which actually says that the growth rate rather adjusts to an exogenously given rate of growth of labor force in efficiency. For instance, in the early part of the 19th century, until about 1825 or 1830, 25 million African slaves were transported across the Atlantic to the New World. After the slave trade had more or less ended, you had from roughly that period, let's say 1825 onwards, right until the First World War, 50 million Indian and Chinese workers being shifted to tropical regions of, settlement, worker settlement. There was an equally large 50 million strong migration within the temperate regions of the world from England and from continental Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But that temperate migration, to regions of temperate white settlement, was something which was kept strongly, kind of separated from the tropical migration. Tropical migration could never occur freely to the metropolis, nor could it occur freely to the temperate regions of white settlement. In fact, it still does not. Now, even though you can migrate to the US, you need to apply for a visa and all kinds of things. So the restrictions upon tropical migration are still there. It was a low-wage migration compared to the high-wage migration in the temperate region. But fundamentally, as I said, up to the First World War, about 50 million Indian and Chinese laborers, Chinese coolie labor, Indian indentured labor, migrated to the tropical regions of settlement. So 25 million of African slaves, 50 million of Indian indentured workers, Chinese coolie workers, 75 million people, in fact, were made to migrate in what one might call the long 20th century. The long 19th century, right up to the end of the First World War. Therefore, capital has moved labor around the world to places wherever it needs them. If there are no workers there, then you shift workers thousands of miles in order to work plantations, to work mines, and so on. So this being the case, to say that capital is hamstrung by labor shortage, that capital is actually constrained by the non-availability of labor is really bizarre. It is unbelievable that the theory which is most current in mainstream economics is a theory that is palpably refuted by all historical evidence. Let me give a second example. All trade theory teaches us that trade is beneficial. As a matter of fact, this is established. Why it is beneficial is established with reference either to Ricardo's comparative advantage or to the Hexer-Rolling theorem. According to which, fundamentally, if countries specialize in the production of particular commodities, then the vector of overall production of commodities, the vector of overall output increases. The vector of overall output increases, taking both countries together, then each country can become better off through trade than would have been otherwise. It follows, therefore, that trade is invariably presented to be beneficial. And trade is invariably presented as a phenomenon which is voluntarily entered into. Because if the vector of world output increases, in that case, I shall voluntarily, as a country, join trade only if I also get a larger, vector-wise larger bit of output, which is perfectly possible because taking all countries together, or the two countries together, the vector of output has increased. Now this flies completely in the face of the experience that we know, where the import of cloth from Britain is something which actually de-industrialized masses of weavers in countries like India, which were colonies, which could not protect themselves. And these weavers then became a kind of impoverished, unemployed mass that really reduced real wages in the countryside, that raised rents in the countryside, increased the pressure of population on land, and generally lay at the origins of the mass poverty that we see in colonial countries like India existing to this day. So trade was unambiguously far from being beneficial for all parties. Trade was unambiguously harmful to one of the parties. Why did the party engage in trade? It did so because it was a colony, and as a colony, it really had no option. It had no say over the trade policy that was adopted by the government that ran the country. But actually, the theoretical basis for it. Okay, so not only is it something that flies in the face of historical evidence, what is more, that the flying in the face of the historical evidence is legitimized by an assumption that underlies trade theory. And that assumption is that all countries can produce all commodities. All countries can produce all commodities. In the pre-trade situations, all countries are producing all commodities, but in the post-trade situation, they may decide to specialize, in which case some countries produce only some commodities, other countries produce other commodities. Now, this idea that all countries produce all commodities, can produce and will produce all commodities, is a completely erroneous idea. Eric Hobsbawm said once, whoever thinks of industrial revolution thinks cotton. Cotton was the fundamental commodity that actually saw the industrial revolution, the manufacturing of cotton. And it occurred in Britain, the pioneer country of industrial revolution. But Britain grows no cotton. The pioneer country of industrial revolution that occurred in cotton does not grow any cotton. Then where did it get the cotton from? It got the cotton from outside. Now suppose the outsiders, what benefit would the outsiders have got for selling cotton to Britain? Because after all, in fact, just think of it this way, that suppose you take even the example that Ricardo gives of England and Portugal. England produces cloth and Portugal produces wine. But England can never produce wine. And therefore, the example itself is flawed when Ricardo says that England is better at producing cloth than at producing wine, because England is not just better at producing cloth, England simply cannot produce any wine whatsoever. Now, it's quite important when you look at it, if England produces no wine, while Portugal can produce both cloth and wine, then when trade takes place, then Portugal will be selling some of its wine to England and instead importing some cloth. In which case, if you take the world wine plus cloth production as a whole, it wouldn't be vector-wise larger. So the fundamental proof of trade being superior breaks down the moment you actually recognize that some countries can't produce some commodity. But on the other hand, on the basis of that, you actually have got this theory that trade is beneficial. And this theory is one which actually obscures the basic proposition that many commodities, particularly tropical primary commodities, which the temperate industrializing countries could not grow at all, were commodities that were actually taken by them under colonial rule to provide the raw materials for the industrial revolution. Another point is that when this happens, obviously, kind of let us say England then enlarges its production of textiles. This production of textiles then is imported by India, and India instead sells larger exports to Britain. Now, the presumption is that when these textiles are imported into India, the textile weavers who are displaced would then go and start producing cloths. I mean, producing cotton. In other words, if there are two activities, A and B, and if one country specializes in A and the other specializes in B, then those who are displaced in the first country in B production would start producing A. But what this misses is that many of these are agricultural commodities. Land area that can be devoted to them is limited, and therefore, when they actually get unemployed because of the import of machine-made manufacturers, then they have nowhere to go. They have to jostle on a given plot of land for greater employment, which typically implies that a given amount of employment is shared out among larger number of people. There's a fall in the per capita incomes of all those who are agriculture dependent. Therefore, the fact that trade benefits all countries, trade benefits all who participate in it, is fundamentally erroneous. But this is a cornerstone of contemporary of trade theory generally, and even of contemporary trade discussions and trade negotiations. You look at the WTO negotiations. The WTO negotiations, in fact, proceed from the fact that trade is beneficial for all, and therefore there should be no hindrances as far as trade is concerned by any particular country trying to withdraw from it or protect itself. Let me now come to my third example. My third example is one where, okay, let me just discuss the, my third example. I can choose one of many, but let me choose the gold standard, which goes back to Hume. Now, David Hume had put forward this idea that in the gold standard, there is an automatic correction mechanism. That suppose a country had a fiscal deficit. Suppose the country has a current account deficit. Then to settle the current account deficit, there would be an outflow of gold. As the outflow of gold takes place, then by the quantity theory of money, there will be a reduction in the level of money, wages, and prices in this country. A smaller amount of medium of circulation. When this happens, this country's goods then become cheaper compared to the goods elsewhere. And when this happens, then this country, there will be greater demand for this country's goods, which is why the current account deficit would automatically right itself. That basically, that deficit would disappear as more and more outsiders would actually buy the goods of this particular country. So the presumption was that there was a specie flow mechanism which acted as an equilibrating mechanism within the gold standard. Now this, again, flies completely in the face of all historical understanding. All history. I'll just mention two ways in which it flies in the face of history. First way, if you look at what actually happened in the gold standard, and you look at the work of economic historians like S.B. Saul, a person who studies in British overseas trade, S.B. Saul says that look at Britain. Britain, if you look at the merchandise trade deficits that Britain had with continental Europe, as well as with the North American colonies or North American countries, North American white countries, that is Canada and the United States, in 1880 and then add to it the amount of capital exports which Britain made again to continental Europe and to the North American countries, then the total requirement of resources that was required for Britain, not only to balance its trade, but also to get the capital exports, was a certain figure. I will not go into the exact figure. Now, that figure, a substantial amount of that figure, was actually settled through the trade with India. That, as a matter of fact, India had a surplus with both continental Europe as well as the North American colonies. And this surplus was appropriated by Britain in a process which people like Dadabhai Naoroji called drain of wealth. And the drain of wealth, therefore, financed Britain's capital exports to these countries, as well as meeting Britain's current account, Britain's merchandise deficits in these countries. In fact, the odd thing was that Britain was making capital exports precisely to those countries with which it actually had a merchandise trade. Normally, it's the other way around. You have a merchandise trade surplus, and this surplus is what constitutes capital export. But in the case of Britain, the opposite was the 19th century. In 1880, Saul's and therefore, according to Saul, a quarter of resources required by Britain, 25% of the resources required by Britain to meet its merchandise trade deficit vis-a-vis continental Europe and North America, as well as to make capital exports to both regions, was met from India. And this proportion had actually gone up by 1910 to 40%. Now, obviously, there is no specie flow mechanism that's working. What you actually have is the using, and India was only one of the colonies, using the colonies, the fact that they were politically under the control of the leading metropolitan capital, or that metropolitan capitalist country, to suck out a drain of wealth from these colonies and to use it for settling its merchandise trade deficit under the gold standard, as well as making capital exports under the gold. There was no automaticity about the elimination of current deficits. What happened was the use of colonial plunder to sustain the gold standard. But no book on economics, no book on the gold standard would actually tell you this. Now, there is a second problem with it, which of course now we know much better after the Keynesian Revolution. Namely, if David Hume was right and gold was only used as the medium of circulation and the quantity theory of money held, then there would be no money which would be held as a store of value, as a form of wealth holding, in which case there can never be involuntary unemployment of the kind that Keynes was doing. In which case capitalism would always be at full employment. And therefore you would never be able to understand why depression occurs, you would never be able to understand why involuntary unemployment. So obviously that entire assumption was wrong. But additionally, I'm trying to say that assumption was wrong, not only because of the fact that it did away with the store of wealth or the form of wealth, gold of money, but it was also wrong because it was historical, that it actually flew in the face of the historical experience. The gold standard was managed because of the fact that there was the colonial loot available to the leading capitalists. Now, this has many manifestations, this has many implications and so on. I don't want to talk about economics, It is about the teaching. When you look at all these examples here, what you actually find is that, that the entire effort is to present capitalism as a system that really does not require colonialism. And all these are actually examples where the role of colonialism has been done away with. That basically the idea is to present that capitalism can originate, develop, and so on without any need for any colony. That's why this emphasis on spontaneous equilibrating mechanism that is there in the capitalism, the spontaneous gold standard equilibrating mechanism that is there in the capitalism, the spontaneous adjustment of the growth rate to the rate of growth of labor force that is there in capitalism. No need for labor from the outlying regions, from the colonies, from the dependencies to be shifted here or there or anywhere. Therefore, the whole idea is to present a prettified picture of capitalism where capitalism does not need. Then why did capitalism have colonies? Why did capitalist countries have colonies? There the argument would be that, okay, political, they, all kinds of theories are there. They acquired colonies in a fit of absent-mindedness, that basically they were people who were concerned about the welfare of the colonial people. And they found that this welfare could be improved if there was British rule, etc. All kinds of political, other kinds of explanations. But the fact that colonialism played an economic role in the development of capitalism is systematically obliterated in all our standard. In fact, I believe economics in that sense is the most extremely ideological subject, where it actually plays the ideological role of obliterating all role of colonialism. I'm not saying that anybody should accept what I'm saying. It is perfectly possible that colonialism didn't play any role. Let that be discussed. Let that be established. But on the other hand, economic theory completely closes its eyes towards that side altogether. It is never discussed. It is never said that, this is what some people believe, but on the other hand, this is not really right. It's not that, but in fact, one side of the story, a side of the story that many historians have established, a side of the story that even in honest English historians have established, is something which is completely obliterated. And I think therein lies the ideological character of economics, a very deeply ideological subject. It's a very deeply metropolitan dominated subject. It's a subject in which there is very little role that people from the colonies, people from the third world, Indians, Africans, and so on, at all play. In fact, the only role, if capitalism develops on its own, if colonialism is not necessary for capitalism, in that case, Europe had this development because it developed capitalism. Africa and India and so on are poor because of the fact that they have not developed capitalism. Therefore, they have to catch up. And then all kinds of, and then development economics is concerned with how countries like India and Africa and so on should be in a position to catch up. But the fact that capitalism in Europe could not have developed without colonialism, the fact that the Industrial Revolution could not have happened in Britain without cotton imports is something, and the fact that these cotton imports were actually from countries where we found that the land area was not being augmented. Out of a given land area, you actually had a more or less fully utilized land area. You had more being developed, more being earmarked for producing goods for the metropolis, which were required as food or raw materials, as opposed to goods required at home. Therefore, there was a shift of land use. None of it figures, and the shift of land use, basically in a situation of given land area, would mean a reduction in per capita availability of many commodities, notably food. The fact that in India there was a more than 25% reduction in per capita availability of food in the last half century of colonial rule, and the fact that that is a symptom of abysmal poverty. That fundamentally, if your food intake, if your per capita food availability is dropping by 25%, then that actually shows an incredible squeeze on the populations living there. None of it figures in. And I believe that is why economics is such an ideological subject. The question then arises, but how can you say it's ideology? Some of the most brilliant minds have worked on this subject. Some of the most honest minds have worked on this subject. In other words, I mentioned Solo's multiple. Solo is an extremely honorable, honest, brilliant person. Then how can you say that they are simply spinning all these theories which actually do damage to our understanding of what happened in history and therefore play an ideological role? Now, this is a very interesting but a very complex question. I think its answer to this question lies in the fact that that even the topmost practitioners in the subject are actually, have a sense of alienation. If Solo did not have this theory, and if instead he had a theory that actually said there's no labor shortage, capitalism actually gets hold of labor from all over the world to meet its labor requirements, in that case, he would be singled out for discrimination within the discipline. In other words, within the discipline, there are certain areas, certain things that are allowed, and certain things which are taboo, which are not. How what is allowed and what is taboo is determined is a complex question. I don't have an answer to this, and I don't know speculation. But on the other hand, it's very much there. I'll tell you a story. Once I had gone to South Africa. In South Africa, I was asked to go and give a lecture in the University of Wits, which is the main university in Johannesburg. So when I went there and I gave my lecture, those days India had had its neoliberal reform, and I was talking about the pitfalls of the neoliberal reform, how they will give rise to impoverishment of substantial. My host, who agreed with me, said, you should be a bit careful. You should not say that the reforms are bad, because then nobody would listen to you. You should rather say that the sequencing of reforms is not right. So it's in that sense. There are certain things which are done, certain things which can be said, certain things which cannot be said. And the point is that the tyranny of the discourse. There are certain things which are actually included in the discourse, there are certain things which are not. If you are discussing things not included in the acceptable discourse, then you really fall out of it. Then fundamentally nobody takes you seriously, then nobody discusses these ideas and so on. Because they too, they don't discuss these ideas not because they are nasty people, not because they are capitalist apologists, but because they themselves, if they start discussing this, would not be taken seriously. Therefore, there is this whole business of certain things being acceptable, certain things being taboo. And this is the kind of tyranny of the discourse which every economist experiences. No matter how big, whether you are Stiglitz or Solo or about the same. Everybody feels need to conform up to a point. If you're very well established, you can be a non-conformist up to a point, but not beyond. Therefore, there is a tyranny of discourse that is implicit in the discipline. The tyranny of discourse also, therefore, dictates the nature of theoretical innovations, and these, in turn, therefore, are really circumscribed. That fundamentally they work to show that capitalism is really a self-contained system, that capitalism has no need for any kind of colonialism or colonies. So this is something which, if in the interests of science, not just in the interests of us being in the third world and this and that, in the interests of science, the interest of breaking the tyranny of the discourse, which is essential for breaking, which is an essential part of breaking all tyrannies. So science can progress only when the tyranny of discourse is broken. And therefore, it's very important for us to think in terms of how to break out of this. And I hope the next year or two, discussing this, you would keep this in mind and discuss ways, at least in our country, how we can actually have a teaching of economics in which students are really introduced into real history. Again, there may be alternative views about it, that's separate. But no view should be pushed under the carpet because it is not respected. No view should be pushed under the carpet because the tyranny of the discourse. Correspondingly, therefore, even those theoretical positions which are in conformity with these kinds of views have to be given their proper hearing, instead of taking things like theory of comparative advantage, theory of growth, and so on as gospel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. I'm sure all the participants in the discussion, have definitely learned, including myself. So there have been a number of questions since we're running behind time. So what I will do is I will read out the questions for Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and he can then address one by one, depending on availability of time. So
how
Professor
long,
Patnaik,
how long do I have?
We have about 15 to 20 minutes.
20, okay, 20 minutes.
Yeah. The first question is the following. One side of the debate argues that capitalism and slavery were tied together in this era, but in the era following this one, slavery was abolished while capitalism continued to grow. Why was this the case? Was it the battle for efficiency? You want to, Professor Patnaik, you want to address all questions at the same time, or do you want it one?
I'll take the whole lot together.
Okay. The second question is, if the brilliant minds like Solo were concerned about being singled out, why would you call them honest? The third question is, how would you connect abolitionism to industrialists?
Sorry, come again. How would I?
How would you connect abolitionism to industrialists? Next question is, you have written extensively on imperialism in the modern era.
Yeah.
You've written extensively on imperialism in the modern era. How does modern imperialism, as you have conceived it, differ from and or is similar to earlier colonialism? Next question is, what mechanism has replaced the drain of wealth as a component of imperialism after the end of colonialism in most parts of the world? The next question is, how is Ricardo's theory of trade involving cloth, wine, and gold different from what is taught in textbooks? Okay. And last question is, can one argue that Say's law is compatible with the short-term demand for money as well?
Sorry, says law.
Yeah, these are the 8 questions we have. One question has been repeated, so it's basically 7 questions.
How is says law compatible with the short-term demand?
Short-term demand for money as well. Short-term wealth demand for money.
Okay, all right. Okay. Yes. Now, I am not for a moment suggesting that slavery per se is essential for capital. No. Just as feudalism per se is not essential for capitalism, just as the caste system per se is not essential for capitalism. Capitalism requires all kinds of commodities. It takes commodities from the tropical countries because it cannot grow those commodities in adequate amounts out there in its home base, and therefore it takes. Similarly, capitalism may require to sell its products in the colonies and so on. And therefore, it wants to have an economic relation. This economic relationship, which of course is imposed on the colonies, is imposed through mediations. Now, these mediations may include slavery, they may include the caste system, they may include feudalism, they may include it. Nothing, slavery alone is not essential for capitalism. The caste system alone is not essential for capitalism, and so on. And therefore, what capitalism does is to just see in any particular country what is the prevalent existing social institution. It uses those social institutions to impose itself on that economy to fulfill its requirements. And of course, the means of doing so is political. So that's basically, I mean, I don't believe slavery per se is necessary. Okay, then solo honest. Well, in the sense that I mean, I'm not going to argue that solo is honest, but the point is that I would just like us to, the whole point of those remarks of mine was to show the people who make these theories are not necessarily people who are making these theories because they want to show that capitalism can do without colonialism. Their motivation is not necessarily one where they actually want to insulate capitalism from the fact of colonialism, where they want to necessarily present a prettified picture of capitalism. They are doing what they consider to be scientific work. But fundamentally, it is scientific work that they think they are doing within certain confines. And that those confines are really the tyranny of the discourse that I was talking about. But if you step outside, then nobody takes you seriously. If you step outside, nobody listens. If you step outside, then you cease to be respected. So that is why, whether you call it honest or not, it doesn't. All right. Then there was a question which I could not actually follow. Not abolitionism. Maybe I'll come back to it later. Okay. Imperialism in the modern era, how different it is. Obviously, imperialism has been changing. Because of which, but I mean, in our book, we try to suggest that throughout history, there's a certain commonality. In other words, while imperialism, the relationship of imperialism to the colonies or to the outlying regions has been changing, not all the role that was being assigned to the colonies are capable of fulfilling now. And therefore, while this is changing, I mean, after all, capitalism is a system of contradictions. It's not something which plans out its kind of perennial existence. So while we argue in our book, Capital and Imperialism, how in some phases, kind of some role has been particularly fulfilled. I mean, for instance, we argue that in the post-Second War, golden age years of capitalism, while imperialism did not play the role of providing markets anymore. I mean, I think we also argue that after the First World War, the market providing role of colonies ceased to be important. The limits had been reached. And we argue the Great Depression was the result of that. So until something new was found, and this new that was found in the post-Second World War period was, of course, state intervention in demand management. Happened in the fascist countries earlier with Roosevelt's New Deal briefly, but fundamentally it came into its own in the post-Second World War. And but so in different periods, capitalism has tried to use colonialism for or the outlying regions, let me say, the periphery for its purposes, not always necessarily successfully, but on the other hand, it has made demands upon the periphery. These demands have changed over time. One demand which has remained common throughout history, in our view, is the fact I mentioned that certain commodities simply cannot be grown in the metropolitan centers. Either they cannot at all be grown, or they cannot be grown in sufficient quantities, or they cannot be grown all the year round. So the metropolis has to depend on the supply of these commodities from the periphery. And of course, in the periphery, since land augmenting change and technical progress is generally being discouraged. In the periphery, therefore, squeezing out these supplies implies a reduction in food self-sufficiency, a reduction in per capita availability. Let me just give you an example. I mean, you can look at the peasant agitation that happened last year in the light of this, because everybody is saying that, look, those who are in favor of these laws the central government had brought in, saying that, look, why do you want the peasants to keep producing food grains? Let the peasants produce all kinds of commodities for which there's a demand elsewhere. Therefore, do away with the minimum prices. And so on. The whole idea is to free up land use so that land can be used to meet the demands of the metropolis, which actually has much bigger purchasing power. Now, this would mean that you would have a reduction in production for the home market, as has happened in Africa, and therefore an undermining of food security. So this is a phenomenon which has occurred throughout the history. All right. What has replaced the drain? Nothing has replaced the drain. As I said, the drain was not just taking these commodities from the tropical agriculture, the tropical region, but taking them free. The drain was taking them free. But on the other hand, if you don't have drain, that doesn't mean, obviously, then you have to pay for it. But on the other hand, that payment doesn't mean the need not to control the production structure of the periphery. Periphery must therefore be made an adjunct, but on the other hand, for the products of the periphery, you pay some amount, while the drain meant that it was gratis. I think there are many people argue that, let's say, all these payments that you make for intellectual property rights and so on, but they're very small compared to the drain in the colonial period. In other words, political independence has actually meant that there has been, over large parts of the world, not everywhere, there has been a reduction in the drain. For some oil-producing countries where you have oil multinationals developing, the drain may still be very large because they take away the oil wells completely, giving very little to the domestic oil. But fundamentally, one can argue that the magnitude of drain has come down. Okay, now Ricardo's example of cloth and wine. Why is it different? My point is that the fact that Ricardo gave an absurd example was clear to everybody. I think many people. Samuelson therefore talks in terms of land and labor, because he knows that capital is a very difficult thing to talk about, because capital implies that capital implies that measurement problem. Now, on the other hand, land and labor don't go into the production of cloth. You know, I mean, anyway, so people have obviously felt very uncomfortable about Ricardo's example. But on the other hand, the gist of that example, the fact that, okay, what is the gist of that example? That example is trying to obfuscate the fact that one of the countries cannot produce one of the countries. Obfuscate the fact that all countries cannot produce all. Ricardo made that assumption. That assumption is essential for the validity of his theory, but that assumption is invalidated by the very example that he gives. But on the other hand, you may choose, you may change the particular examples, but fundamentally, phenomenon that the whole range of commodities cannot be produced in the temperate regions, which can be produced in the tropical regions. And the temperate regions needs them for the development of industrial capitalism, and therefore has to acquire them at the expense of the tropical region. That's an undeniable fact, but they're trying to deny. All right. Say's law short term. I don't understand why Say's law should at all be in the short term valid, because Say's law is fundamentally invalid. Okay, what is the negation of Say's law? You remember Marx's CMC circuit. I go sell some commodities, get hold of some money, and then use that money to buy some other commodities. Marx called it the CMC circuit. Now, if, like an automaton, I sell those commodities today, and exactly in a month's time, and I go and buy other commodities, in that case, the velocity of circulation of money is constant. You have the Cambridge K, which is constant, and you have quantity theory holding, and there is no wealth demand for money. The only money that is being demanded is as medium of circulation. Money is being held as wealth for a month, but on the other hand, if you like, the medium of circulation role and the wealth role of money were less. But a separate wealth role of money becomes clear if it is the case that instead of holding it for a month, I decide to hold it for a fortnight, and then I quickly go and buy other commodities, in which case my demand for money as wealth has reduced. If instead of holding it for a month, I decide to hold it for 2 months, because I find that I can get more commodities after 2 months for the same amount of money that I can get after a month. In that case, my demand for money as a form of wealth has increased. Therefore, it is not short-term or long-term. It is the question, I mean, I think it's fundamentally wrong to detach a medium of circulation role of money from a wealth role of money, that you can do by saying that there is an absolute fixed periodicity for which there's absolutely no reason. And the moment you give up that assumption of a constant K, come from a constant periodicity, then you find that money is held as wealth. And if money is held as a form of wealth, in that case, involuntary unemployment is then it would face problems like his law breaks. Thank you.
Okay, Professor
Sorry,
Patnaik,
one
actually,
question I could not. Yes, sorry.
yeah, what has happened is we have had another 4-5 questions, and we also have another 15 minutes or so. So should we take a second round of questions?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So, sir, I'll just start with the second round of questions. Can one describe? Yeah. Next question is: can one describe the post 1971 World Monetary System as being based on a commodity? If yes, is it gold, oil, or any other commodity? Okay, next is actually a comment. Yeah, next is a comment. The comment is, thank you for your response. It explains why Austrian economics is not popular. Okay. Then you have another comment and question. Thanks, Professor Patnaik, for your presentation. When you say that colonial discourse on the origins of capitalism do not discuss the reasons at length, is it because it has a Western orientation? Okay, the next question is, what will be the impact of the economic rise of China on the imperialist system? Then we have another question. What, if anything, can be gained today from debating or engaging with mainstream economists? Or should heterodox economists only seek to address others outside the mainstream? And the last question is it possible for the current conflict in Ukraine to initiate a set of processes that can undermine the role of the US dollar as a reserve currency? These are the second set of questions, Professor Patnaik.
Okay, quite a lot. Yeah. All right. Post 1971 monetary system. You know, what was special about gold? Why is it that we talked about the gold standard? Or you see, basically the presumption behind gold was that the price of gold relative to the world of commodities remains relatively fixed. In other words, that if there's a rise in prices of commodities, then there would always be a rise in the price of gold. And on the other hand, if there's a fall in the price of commodities, that gold in that sense was the representative commodity. It's very rarely the case that actually you would find that the price of gold moves up or down on its own for any length of time. It may happen kind of a few hours or a day or whatever, but not secularly. Now, in that sense, I think one can think in terms of any particular commodity or a basket of commodities you can think of may have these characteristics, that their prices don't move way out of line secularly vis-a-vis the prices of the rest of the commodities. Now, I believe oil can be such a commodity because it's a very important. True that oil prices fluctuate a lot because of speculation, but if you take a longer period of time, then you have this longer period of time. Generally, it should be the case that commodity prices and oil prices should be moving around together. Because if oil prices suddenly rise, then they would tend to get passed on in the form of commodity. So I wrote a book about it called The Value of Money, in which I was talking about the oil dollar standard. I think I would still stick to that. I would still stick to describing the world that we see to be as an oil dollar standard. Which is not to say that the price of oil in terms of dollar is absolutely fixed. Of course, it varies a great deal by speculative factors and so on. But secularly, there is, in my view, no tendency as yet for a movement of oil prices upward. Okay. Austrian economies, all right, that's a comment. Then we have Western. Okay, how do we relate to the Western economies? I mean, I think that's the. Isn't that so? There's a question about how do we relate. I mean,
do you want me to read the question again?
The third one.
Yeah. So the question is, thanks, Professor Patnaik, for your presentation. When you say that colonial discourse on the origins of capitalism do not discuss the reasons at length, is it because it has a Western orientation?
Oh, that. No. I mean, I think colonial origins or colonial help for capitalism is something which is not discussed in economics, as I mentioned, for ideological reasons. It's not the Western orientation, it's the capitalist orientation. And of course, I mean, I think economics is fundamentally a subject of capitalism. I mean, I think, and because of that, you actually find, you look at Adam Smith. Adam Smith is scathing about the plunder of Bengal, but he puts the blame for it on the fact that Bengal is ruled by the East India Company, not by the British Crown. Now, when Bengal got ruled by the British Crown, there was no improvement in the conditions of the Bengal peasantry. So the point is that 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 the it is a refusal to look at the nature of capitalism as dependent upon colonial crops of various kinds, which is responsible. So because economics is subject developed under capitalism, I mean, it's actually an accompaniment of capitalism. The question on China, the question on China, okay, I mean, I think we can all speculate for great lengths of time, but we are short of time, so I would not like to go into it at all. All right, what can be gained if we don't talk to things? You see, it is not a question. Frankly, all this business about that heterodox should talk to heterodox, orthodox should talk to. No. I think we should just do economics. If somebody listens to us, well and good. If somebody doesn't listen to us, fine. That's very sad. But on the other hand, I mean, it would in practice be the case, perhaps, that actually the heterodox would listen to us. But on the other hand, I don't think we should therefore confine ourselves to talking to the heterodox. It's possible that they alone would come to listen to me. But on the other hand, I don't see why I should go only talking to the heterodox. I'm not in favor of that. We should be in favor of economics as a discipline that transcends ideological values. Actually, in something, because the whole idea is to make it a scientific discourse where we argue on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of ideology. My criticism of mainstream economics, as I tried to suggest, is on the basis of evidence, is on the basis of the industrialization that occurred here, is on the basis of the fact that India actually met Britain's gold standard deficit requirements and so on and so forth. Or that slaves were being transported instead of solo shortage, labor shortage. So I think we should discuss on the basis of evidence and discuss scientifically. Whoever listens to us, well. All right, then Ukraine. Well, I mean, I've been writing about this. That fundamentally what Russia did is that it's now saying that, look, we would demand payment for our oil exports in terms of rubles. And our price of oil in terms of rubles is fixed. Now, if that happens, then not only would the ruble be stabilized, because as you know, the ruble has dropped because of the fact that export revenues can't flow back to Russia because of these SWIFT arrangements being disrupted, because of reserves being impounded. But if that happens, then not only would the ruble stabilize, but then the ruble may actually become a form of wealth holdings on a par with the dollar. Some people argue that the Chinese currency may also play a similar role. But China, for the time being, we don't know what they will do. But fundamentally, if the Russians actually say that we insist on ruble payment for our oil and the oil price is fixed in terms of rubles, in that case, the ruble is going to emerge as a challenger to the dollar. Not necessarily that is going to displace dollars, but is going to emerge as a challenger to the dollar, and that would be a threat to the dollar. The fact that the sanctions are going to undermine the entire neoliberal order is by now quite clear. If you have all these bilateral arrangements, one thing having bilateral arrangements only with Iran when there were sanctions against Russia is a big country. So if you have all these bilateral arrangements, rupee payment arrangements, and so on, and that is really a substantial departure from the neoliberal economic order. And if in addition, within that departure, people hold on to dollars, hold on to rubles, then that is going to be a challenge to me.
Professor Prabhat Patnaik, actually, there are two final questions. So if you have the time, we can take them. So, yeah. So the penultimate question is, Professor Patnaik, thanks for a wonderful lecture. Why do we always forget to mention Dr. B.R. Ambedkar while talking about economists and their contributions towards economics during the colonial period? Dr. Ambedkar did pioneering research on various aspects of Indian economic problems of that time. The last question is, Professor Patnaik, could you suggest some readings for someone interested in economics? Your top 5 book suggestions.
Okay. I agree. You see about B.R. Ambedkar. In fact, Thorat has written a book about it, which is quite Deo Thorat, which should be read. Yes, I completely agree. But I was, of course, referring to economics as a subject, as a subject that is given to us as a discipline that all of us are more or less obliged to teach in our university. Okay, so top 5, that's a very difficult thing to say. I tell you what, you take my email address from Sharath and write me a mail. I will get back to you with the suggestion of the top 5, because it's very difficult to think of only 5. There are many books to read. So I'll get back to you if you just write.
Okay. So, it has been a wonderful session. The discussion has been very lively. I would have wanted it to go on, but actually we're reaching the end of the time for the keynote address. So thank you to all the participants as well as the panelists for participating, and thank you to Professor Prabhat Patnaik also. And now back to the organizers so that we can move on to the next session. Thank you.
Goodbye.